From the Toronto Star, I'm Raju Mudhar, and this matters. There's an old saying about how crime doesn't take a holiday. That's definitely true during this COVID-19 pandemic. It seems so long ago, but you remember this guy?
This was in poor taste in retrospect. What I did, I stood up, I said, can I have everybody's attention? I just came back from Hunan province. I had my camera with me. I was looking to get a viral video. I was looking to get it up on all the social media platforms.
That's James Potok talking to Global News, who you may remember as the plane virus guy, who made a WestJet flight turn around from Jamaica after his attempt to go viral failed. He's the first local person who committed what we're calling virus crimes. Since then, he's definitely not alone. There are a number of COVID-19 related frauds and scams online. Premier Doug Ford has been naming and shaming price gougers and has increased penalties to stop them.
If you're selling face masks, protective gloves, cold medicine, hand sanitizer, and disinfecting wipes, and you're hiking the price 5 times, 10 times what it should be, you're done. You're gone.
A Toronto man was busted for trying to send test kits across the border, and Toronto police even charged several street racers who were burning up the empty roads. There are several more virus-related incidents around the world across the spectrum of crimes. Like in the US, there is a senator who's currently being investigated for insider trading, and Dutch criminals recently stole a Vincent van Gogh painting in an overnight raid on a museum that was closed due to the virus. Beyond actual criminals, law enforcement now also has to take up the challenge of enforcing quarantine laws against their own people. To discuss virus crimes and what other bad actors may be trying to take advantage of this pandemic, we are joined by Stephanie Carvin, who is an assistant professor of international relations at the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs at Carleton University. She's an expert on security issues and has consulted for the U.S. Department of Defense and worked as a security analyst for the Government of Canada. She also hosts a podcast called Intrepid. Thank you so much for being with us.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
Professor Carvin, we are living in uncertain times, and while there are some people who are being positive and being helpful, there are the others. There are those who are trying to take advantage of this situation. I've mentioned already that there's been some pranksters, a politician accused of insider trading, and even some street racers who are enjoying the rest of us being isolated. Is there any surprise that there are people who are trying to take advantage of the situation?
No, not really. I think you see this with other incidents of importance. This one is pretty important, but I think we've seen this, when there's disasters or events occurring in other parts of the world, you'll often see email scammers turn the themes of their email to that. So one of the things is, we've seen a lot of forest fires in Western Canada, so you may see scams associated with that and on people's minds. And so the idea that with a massive global event like COVID-19, that you would see individuals take advantage of people's panic, people's concern, maybe at a time when they're letting their guard down because, they're so trying to focus on the constant stream of news that's coming at us at all times. It's not that surprising, I think, that you would see this kind of rise in both cyber and real world incidents.
Let's talk specifically about those online phishing scams. There's been a rise. There's been some warnings. I believe Prime Minister Trudeau has mentioned something. The World Health Organization has put a warning on its site that it would never send any sort of emails out. What do you think of these frauds, and what should people be wary of?
So, it's interesting. Immediately after Trudeau announced I believe it's the Canadian Emergency Response Benefit, the benefit that Canadians who have been impacted by COVID-19 can apply for, people started getting text messages saying, oh, here's your, link to the benefit, just click here. And, people who may not know better or may have thought, oh, this is it. I just saw the Prime Minister speak about this. They're going to click on that. So it makes a lot of sense. When you see people craft these emails, they're often kind of hidden behind official kind of cover, so people let their guard down. And, in normal times, we often see this with banks, right? A lot of times fraudsters will take the time to craft their emails so they look like they're banks or they look like they're some kind of institution. I think if I look at my spam inbox right now, I've won something like $100,000 from the various emails that are pretending to be Costco. So it's like these are the kinds of ways that hackers try to trick you. It's not just instilling panic, but also making you think that it's coming from someone that you actually trust. People are obviously seeing the World Health Organization in the news. People are seeing the Prime Minister. They're seeing these benefits being announced, and the government saying, hey, we're going to start rolling this out. And you get a text message saying, oh, here it is. Maybe you're not going to think twice on clicking on that. So I think that's an important thing. The other thing thing that I hear that is really important as well is the fact that so many people now are working remotely and they're not in their office. So they may have more advanced IT infrastructure or, like tech support that could do a better job of perhaps helping to filter out some of these emails. So emails that may not have gotten to people before are potentially getting to them now. So this is another major problem. And, if people took their laptops or workstations home with them, perhaps their loved ones are using their computer for purposes that it's not really meant to. So there's vulnerabilities there. There's really so many opportunities. And I think this is why, we are seeing reports of so many different kinds of cyber incidents and cyber risks that are now kind of emerging in the wake of this crisis.
What else are cyber criminals trying to take advantage of? I know the World Health Organization has been under cyber attack, and one of the issues here is that there's just so much data going around right now regarding this virus, and so people are trying to go after it. Is that fair to say?
It's absolutely fair to say. I mean, this is the dark side of it. We often hear about malicious actors who are engaged in these activities. Sometimes it's organized crime. Sometimes it's state actors. And so, we're at a time where even our national security agencies are having to work with more skeletal staff because they need to engage in social distancing as well. And so that makes it harder to actually protect Canada's critical infrastructure and some of the institutions that we're seeing. So, on the one hand, there may be malicious actors who are trying to take advantage of all the chaos that's going on, using it as an opportunity to gather more intellectual property for IP theft, so engaging in IP theft, engaging in perhaps even state-to-state espionage because they know that, the resources of the state are kind of either maxed out or reduced because of social distancing policy. So that's another risk that we're absolutely seeing. But some of this data, even about the disease, it's very likely that a number of countries want to develop their own vaccines as quickly as possible. And so maybe engaged in theft with regards to data. Canada has several major research labs working on this as we speak. We've already seen the national laboratory where we develop vaccines out in, I believe it's Manitoba, that was attacked or accusations of insider threat behavior where someone who was inside was trying to steal the intellectual property or is alleged to perhaps have been stealing the intellectual property from that facility with regards to diseases. So when you're dealing with a situation with a pandemic, it's not that surprising that not only would you, try to kind of take advantage, generate the kind of chaos at a criminal level, at a state-to-state espionage level, but also then trying to get data about how populations are being affected, what medical treatments people are using, and then even potentially stealing information regarding vaccines that states could be using to develop their own strategies in order to deal with this, but, not going about getting the information in a way that would be open and transparent.
I could see a nightmare scenario in this public health emergency with a hospital getting afflicted by ransomware programming, which has already happened across this country a number of times. I'm happy to say that I haven't heard anything like that yet, but that could obviously be a threat here, correct?
Absolutely correct. This is the great thing about being a national security analyst is that there's no end to the terrible scenarios that run through your mind. And that was definitely one of them. The idea that, we've already seen so many hospitals being impacted by ransomware in these attacks. And ransomware, for your audience, if they're not aware, it's basically malicious software that locks up and freezes your computer and then says, okay, well, we'll release this if you pay us money, often through Bitcoin or, some other digital currency. And then they may or may not give you that information back. And we've seen hospitals who, of course, like to put money towards patients and not necessarily having the most up-to-date IT infrastructure get attacked by this time and time again. And there's been a number of Canadian medical institutions that have been targeted. We've seen in the United States, there's an attempt to run what's called a denial of service attack against the Department of Homeland Security during the time. And of course, the Department of Homeland Security has an important role to play in pandemic preparation and trying to address it. The attack wasn't successful, but it's kind of indicative of the fact that, someone was really just trying to gum up the U.S. government servers to try and hinder its response to a very serious situation. So there's that kind of cybercrime that you worry about as well. It's not just people trying to take things or people trying to rob things. It's people actually also just trying to sow chaos. People being, people doing it for fun or people, malicious state actors who just want to cause mischief at a time when resources are already strained because, it helps to feed into their various narratives about how the West is in chaos and things like this.
What else worries you? What else might bad actors be trying to do now?
There's the whole cyber side, which, national security is trying to deal with. And then we've seen reports that basically individuals of a far-right mindset are looking at this as an opportunity, right? So they themselves are, debating whether or not they can get COVID-19 and then try to spread it as much as possible because they want to sow, like other malicious actors, they want to sow chaos because it suits, in their mind, their political ends. We saw this week a horrific report where someone heard about an order to a lockdown order effectively and tried to blow up a hospital with a car bomb, effectively targeting the very people that are engaged in trying to save lives of these COVID-19 patients. So the medical workers themselves could be targeted in some of these attacks from, in particular, the far right. Perhaps it could also be the Islamic State, just because, again, there's a lot of political and ideological and certain kind of religious movements that are violent extremists that want to make people even more scared than they already are. And this is what concerns me, particularly from the far right. I worry, there's reporting by Ben McCouch from Vice Media who suggests that what he's seeing in the chat rooms from so-called accelerationists are people who are trying to basically, they believe that the U.S. is eventually going to descend into some kind of chaos or civil war, and they want to speed up that happening. And they obviously are going to see a pandemic as a way to make that happen even faster. So these are the kinds of national security nightmares that organizations like the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, Communications Security Establishment, the RCMP, are having to deal with at a time when they're probably running on much reduced staff because of social distancing requirements. But also, in the case of the RCMP, they're often police services. They're having to basically help with the general response to the pandemic in the first place.
One of the interesting things right now is that law enforcement now has to turn to policing its own people with respect to quarantine rules. There's already been a few arrests. What do you think the challenges are surrounding this?
So the Quarantine Act is really interesting. The Quarantine Act isn't something that's invoked. The Quarantine Act is always in place, but certain provisions can then be enacted through cabinet, basically putting them into place. And, there's different rules at the federal level, and then there's different emergency powers at the provincial level. And I think there was perhaps a hesitation to enact the Quarantine Act provisions that would apply here. And they are serious, right? I mean, we are talking individuals can face, depending on the severity of their action and the purpose behind their actions, a fine of up to $1 million and I believe up to 3 years in jail. So, it's fairly serious, but I think governments don't want to put this in place because how do you police this? There's been a lot of talk about data and surveillance in this particular pandemic. It's not clear to me that we have the actual institutional tools to make that happen. We don't have some kind of surveillance switch we can just somehow flick on. So, a lot of this quarantine monitoring is going to have to be done manually. It's going to have to be done, hopefully, using the good faith of people. But do you really want a situation where people are basically flooding the lines, calling and ratting out their neighbors for these kinds of behaviors? Again, at a time when frontline responders are already probably pretty busy with, just trying to manage the situation in hand. But that being said, a lot of the reports about people coming back to Canada and then going to grocery stores or interacting with friends, people who traveled and subsequently went to funerals, and, this is how we've seen the community spread in Canada. There seems to be a recognition that, unfortunately, this stuff was necessary, but how it's actually enforced is going to be a really interesting scenario going forward.
How do you think this is going to affect civil liberties?
That's a really interesting question. There's a lot of fear that, we've put these things into place, but do they have sunset clauses? How long will it take for the government to dismantle this? We've had to put the system into place, these kind of social distancing, shutting things down, and now bringing into power part of the Quarantine Act. We've seen cities and the provinces, not yet the federal government, enact emergency legislation. I think one of the most important things for us right now is that we're all a little bit in a state of chaos, but we still need our political institutions to function. We still need them to be challenging decisions, not in kind of a partisan political way, but in a thoughtful, constructive way. So I'm hoping that, some of the questions we have regarding more drastic means or surveillance like this will be put to Parliament, even if it has to operate in a more remote way or in a much more scaled down way. But we still need our institutions to function. And I think that's what provides a stronger, better, more legitimate response. But There's a lot of people who are concerned that if we do put stricter surveillance mechanisms in place, that we would be building a lot of these very quickly. If you wanted to do this, who would supervise it? What agencies would actually be in charge of managing the data? How would that data be stored? How would it be monitored? And then there's very practical issues as well. Like, how would you train people to monitor unless it was the security services doing it? But do you want the security services monitoring James and Betsy, who've just gotten back from Florida, to, make sure that they're not going to Walmart? That's a balancing issue. So I think some of the concerns with regards to whether or not we can actually, we've put a lot of things in place. Have we put in place oversight and review of these steps that are being taken, and how will we eventually dismantle it? We just haven't had that conversation yet, simply because the need to kind of scale up so quickly. But these are important conversations we're going to have. On the other hand, I think some of the concerns are a little exaggerated, simply because the surveillance kind of mechanisms we're hearing about in other countries, such as part of Asia, South Korea, as well as even Israel, they have a far more robust surveillance infrastructure that Canada simply doesn't have. I don't think we're at the nightmare scenario yet. There's very good practical reasons why you would not put a major surveillance regime in place. These are important things, but I know that people are watching and waiting to see what steps the government does take. It's interesting because when you often see politicians being asked in media conferences as to whether or not they're considering Measure X to, say, mass surveillance to make sure that people aren't going to parties, they always respond, well, everything's on the table. But that's probably because they haven't actually thought through it yet. And they probably aren't sure if this is something that we can or should do. But I wouldn't read too much into this. The potential is, if this goes on for months and we continue to see large amounts of cyber attacks, if there's a possibility of violent extremist attacks by individuals who just want to sow more chaos, there could be further clampdown on civil liberties, the need for more surveillance writ large. But I don't think we're there yet. It's too bad that we just can't hope that the criminals all stay at home like the rest of us. Well, some of them are, right? Some of them are staying at home. And I've heard rumors that actually the makers of malware, the kind of computer viruses that infect people's computers where you can either steal their data or use ransomware, they're actually offering discounts on their services because there's so many more people at home and giving people the opportunity to actually engage in this. So I think, what we need is social distancing from crime. Thank you, Stephanie, for your time today. We really, really appreciate it. Thanks for having me on. That was Stephanie Carvin, who is an assistant professor of international relations at the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs at Carleton University. That's it for today. Thanks so much for joining us. This Matters is hosted and produced by me, Raju Mudhar, Adrian Chung, and Saba Etisaz. Produced and mixed by Sean Pattenden, and our director of programming is JP Fozo. Our show theme music is by So Called, and our episode music is by Mike DeAngelis. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.